Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about league-winning running backs for the 2023 fantasy football season. Now, in order to predict future success at the running back position, what I often do is look towards the past, the history of fantasy football. Last season, amongst all running backs, the pure league winners were players such as Tony Pollard, Ramondre Stevenson, Josh Jacobs, Miles Sanders, Jamal Williams, and Kenneth Walker. Players that in their own right, based on their average draft position last season, were not only just sleepers, but absolute league winners. I mean, we're talking about Kenneth Walker last season on Underdog Fantasy being selected as the player 122 overall. Players like Josh Jacobs, 82 overall. The players that we could potentially find later in our drafts that have league winning upside are plentiful. It's just a matter of, can we identify the league winning archetype in the running backs that have the potential to reach that overall upside? Now, when we go ahead and look at those specific running backs, Pollard, Stevenson, Jacobs, Sanders, Williams, and Kenneth Walker, specifically, 4 of those players were backups at the beginning of the 2022 season that were able to take over their backfield primarily due to injuries. Of course, Tony Pollard had himself success prior to Zeke's injury, but then fourth, after Zeke missed those 2 games in a row, and Tony Pollard was averaging over 30 fantasy points per game throughout those 2 contests in a half PPR scoring format, he took over. Then we had Ramondre Stevenson, who had, of course, Damian Harris ahead of him. Damian Harris goes down. Then Ramondre Stevenson flourishes as the running back that we expected him to be. Similar to Jamal Williams, we all expected and drafted DeAndre Swift last season as a top 12 running back because the expectation was that he was going to stay healthy and he was going to be able to succeed. And unfortunately, though DeAndre Swift was successful prior to his injury, but as soon as he got injured, the entire priority of this backfield changed and gave Jamal Williams that opportunity. Same thing with Kenneth Walker. Many of us expected that potentially Rashad Penny would find himself injured because that has just been his overall career, unfortunately. He once again got injured and Kenneth Walker was able to run away with the job. Now, in the case of Josh Jacobs, Miles Sanders, those are just running backs that were being undervalued. And we're going to be able to identify running backs such as those. But when we talk about running backs that potentially can benefit from being a backup at the beginning of the 2023 season, all have lower ADPs and can potentially take over their respective backfield. I'm talking about players like Dalvin Cook, Samaje Perine, AJ Dillon, Zach Charbonnet, Roschon Johnson, and Jaylen Warren. Now, I don't expect these players to absolutely 100% be league winners, and I'm not suggesting that you draft every single one of them. What I'm suggesting is when we look at the history of fantasy football, specifically last season, the running backs that had that league winning upside were coming from backfields and were able to take over based on the circumstances and variables of that backfield changing over the course of the season. So when we go into 2023, of course, Dalvin Cook is backing up Breece Hall, coming off of an ACL injury. And if that ACL injury is going to potentially be a factor, perhaps Dalvin Cook, who has been a top 15 fantasy back in a half PPR scoring format since 2019 every single season, despite his own injuries, has the potential of being a league-winning potential running back, especially in consideration with this offense and how much they're continuing to grow and how their personnel is continuing to improve with their offensive linemen coming back healthy. Now, when we talk about Samaje Perine, he's in a very similar situation. The reason why he joined the Denver Broncos is because Javonte Williams is coming off a massive ACL and LCL injury. There was other structural damage within that knee as well. So if in fact Samaje Perine is going to be given an opportunity in a scenario in which Javonte Williams is going to miss any sort of time due to a hiccup throughout the course of the season. I mean, we saw Samaje Perine last season. When Joe Mixon missed any time, he was averaging over 17 fantasy points per game for the Cincinnati Bengals. We know these running backs are capable. Now, when we look at someone like AJ Dillon, it's a little bit different because he's backing up Aaron Jones. And this offense, the Green Bay Packers last season, they had the 8th most running back rushing attempts amongst all teams in the National Football League, which totaled to 410 total rushing attempts. So is this team really going to be able to run the ball even more this season and gives, a guy like AJ Dillon more value? It's going to be tough. Again, they can maybe run the ball 50 more times this upcoming season, be the #1 rushing team in the National Football League in terms of overall running back rushing attempts. And that could give AJ Dillon a little bit more value, but can he overtake Aaron Jones? So unless Aaron Jones is going to miss time, it really is going to be an unlikely scenario in that overall situation. So as compelling as AJ Dillon could be based on his current ADP and the value that he has, very similar to someone like Ramondre Stevenson from last season, going into this year, it's not a guarantee. And that's what makes it tough. Same thing with Zach Charbonnet. Again, we picked up Kenneth Walker last year because of the injury history of Rashad Penny. But picking up Zach Charbonnet this year in the rotation with Kenneth Walker is going to be difficult because Kenneth Walker is a young player. He's only going into his 2nd year. So do I believe in Zach Charbonnet to immediately be able to overtake this backfield similar to guys that we saw last season? Very unlikely. So AJ Dillon, Zach Charbonnet, not the greatest overall options in comparison to when I look at guys like Dalvin Cook and Samaje Perine, where there is precedent that has been set with injuries to those starting running backs to those teams that, of course, give these 2 players value. Now, when we talk about Roschon Johnson or potentially Jalen Warren, Roschon Johnson could very easily take the job from Khalil Herbert. He is considered the starting running back of the Chicago Bears, but it's his job to lose purely. And Roschon Johnson is talented enough to take this job. He's a player that you can get very late in drafts as a handcuff option and isn't going to give you flex opportunities, but can give you the potential upside of a rookie running back that steals the job of their overall, backfield and runs away with it purely. Now, even though many people are predicting that could potentially happen with Jalen Warren, I think that's very unlikely as well. Jalen Warren is going to play as the RB2 of this team. He's going to be the third down back. He's hyper efficient in his overall opportunities, but in terms of his overall potential upside, at very best, he's going to be a 2017 Austin Eckler, where yes, he's going to have himself receiving upside, rushing work, and the potential sprinkle of a couple touchdowns, but is he going to be able to completely overtake this backfield? I mean, he could end up being this year's Tony Pollard. Time will tell. But when we talk about these players, they all have the potential of being league winners. But is it guaranteed? Can I promise you that these are guys that you need to be drafting? No. Some of these investments you can make because they are significantly lower average draft positions. So you may be able to invest in them and it's not going to make an impact on the bottom line of your team. You've already gone ahead and selected players that are going to be the pillars of your rosters, players at the running back, wide receiver, tight end, and quarterback position that are going to carry you throughout the entirety of the season. But these are players that are complementary, that over the course of the season can be lottery tickets of a sort. Now, with all that taken into account, I have 6 other players that I want to talk about who I truly believe are league-winning running backs. These players have the potential. They could end up doing it. And keep that in mind as you go into your 2023 fantasy football draft. But I want to talk about players that are purely the starting running backs of their teams and going into this upcoming year are often undervalued, just like a Josh Jacobs last year or potentially Miles Sanders. Players that in my mind going into the 2023 season can very easily help you capture a 2023 fantasy football championship. Now, before we get into talking about those players, another way to help yourself capture a 2023 fantasy football championship this season is by subscribing to the channel. Again, we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season. All of this for the singular purpose of trying to help you capture a 2023 fantasy football championship. So if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe today. Thank you very much. Now, for those of you who want additional advantages upon your league mates going into the 2023 season, whether it's on draft night or whether it's throughout the entirety of the year, weeks 1 through 18, be sure to travel down to the description of the video and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get a first-time deposit match, you're additionally going to get my 2023 fantasy football draft guide and rankings. Those rankings are by position, by tier, top 200 flex, half PPR, full PPR, 4-point per passing touchdown, 6-point per passing touchdown, all encompassing in order to help you. Additionally, that draft guide is my methodologies as to how I draft each singular, primary position, whether it's quarterback, running back, wide receiver, or tight end, in the statistics that I've gathered over the last decade of fantasy football in order to justify those overall draft paths and methodologies. Additionally, besides going ahead and getting all of the help for draft day, you're also going to get an email from me every single Sunday morning, weeks 1 through 18, with individual positional, by tier rankings, half PPR, full PPR with flex, so that regardless of what you're doing this upcoming season, on Sunday mornings, you'll have my rankings ready to go, setting your lineups and leading to success. So if you're interested in helping me help you, be sure to go ahead and check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. Sign up today using code Andrew. And of course, draft responsibly via Underdog Fantasy today. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about some league-winning running backs that are, besides, of course, the players that we previously mentioned. These are players that, in comparison, of course, have higher ADPs. These are players like BIJAN Robinson going in the first round, but I truly do believe he has league-winning upside based on where he's being selected, at the back end of the first. Yes, he's a rookie running back, but when you look at the history of success of running backs who were selected within the top 8 of their overall NFL draft, we're talking about running backs that since 2013, in the last decade of football, there have only ever been 4 other circumstances outside of BIJAN Robinson in 2023. So we have Saquon Barkley, Leonard Fournette, Ezekiel Elliott, and Christian McCaffrey as the only other examples. And all of those running backs in their rookie years, in a half PPR scoring format, not only finished as top 12 running backs, but in terms of the averages over the course of all their statistics, these running backs were averaging 240 plus rushing attempts, over 1,100 rushing yards, 9 rushing touchdowns, 81 targets in their rookie season, 60 receptions, 500 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, and over 262 fantasy points in a half PPR their rookie season. That is the potential in which BIJAN Robinson has going into the 2023 season, especially considering he is joining an offense with Arthur Smith, who, again, many of us remember back in the days of 2019 through 2020, he was with the Tennessee Titans and, of course, helped Derrick Henry in that entire offense run the ball down every team's throat. There's a reason why Derrick Henry was was able to accomplish the 2,000-yard rushing season back in 2020 primarily had to do with, of course, Arthur Smith and the rushing attack that they went ahead and constructed for that offense. Now, since then, he has joined the Atlanta Falcons. He is their current primary play caller and their head coach. Last season, amongst all teams in the National Football League, the Atlanta Falcons ran the ball with their running backs the second most times and had the most rushing yards amongst all teams' overall running backs. Those numbers obviously significant, especially when you take into consideration amongst all teams in 2022, the Atlanta Falcons were the only team in the National Football League who had more running back rushing attempts than quarterback passing attempts. 454 attempts on the ground from running backs compared to 415 passing attempts from their quarterbacks. Now, on the ground, Bijan Robinson's going to find success, but additionally, they're going to give him opportunities through the air, whether they line up out wide in the slot or even out of the backfield. When you go back to 2021, Cordero Patterson and Mike Davis out of this backfield accumulated 106 targets behind the line of scrimmage or from 0 to 9 yards down the field. There is going to be opportunities for Bijan Robinson to be a workhorse back and get himself 18 plus touches every single game, whether it's on the ground or through the air, because this offense is built for it behind their incredibly elite offensive line. Additionally, when you have Desmond Ridder as your starting quarterback, it does not imply the potential risk, like someone like Marcus Mariota last season being the starting quarterback of this team, presents when he has the rushing ability down in the red zone. So when you have Desmond Ridder, and we saw last season from weeks 15 through 18 as the starting quarterback of this team, when he was a starter, this team ran the ball with their running backs 31 times per game, and they targeted their running backs in the passing game 6.75 times. There is going to be a lot more upside within this offense, and even with Tyler Algier getting his touches, Bijan Robinson is absolutely a league-winning running back. Now, when we go ahead and move on, a reminder, if you guys have not yet already, be sure to go ahead and check out the 1.01 brand, the official merchandise line of the Andrew Kiorkof YouTube channel. Again, it's available now. You can travel down to the description of the video, click on the link, and head on over to andrewkiorkofshop.com. Be sure to go ahead, support the channel, and rep greetings and salutations this upcoming season. Of course, stylish, comfortable, and of course, high-quality clothing for your most stressful of upcoming fantasy football Sundays. Check it out today. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about another league-winning running back. It's another rookie. It is JAHMYR GIBBS. This offseason, I was hesitant on JAHMYR GIBBS early on in the month of August, primarily because, again, David Montgomery is going to make an impact, and David Montgomery is going to play the Jamal Williams role within this offense. But what purely JAHMYR GIBBS has in terms of potential upside is something that, David Montgomery really isn't going to be able to tap into. It's the receiving upside and the highly efficient nature of his rushing work and, of course, receiving work. So going into 2023, when we have Dan Campbell as the head coach, and of course, an offensive-minded head coach, someone who coached underneath and is within the coaching tree of Sean Payton, and was with that overall offense back in 2017 when Alvin Kamara was a rookie, and both Alvin Kamara and Mark Ingram were both top 6 fantasy backs within that given season. There is a potential in which this organization, with Ben Johnson returning as their offensive coordinator, and of course finding themselves a lot of success with DeAndre Swift and Jamal Williams last season, they're going to recreate that with David Montgomery and JAHMYR GIBBS. And if JAHMYR GIBBS is going to be filling in for the DeAndre Swift's role, you got to remember, in the last 23 healthy games that DeAndre Swift has played for the Detroit Lions since 2021, he's been averaging 5.78 targets per game, 4.26 receptions per game, 35 receiving yards per game, and 0.22 receiving touchdowns per game. If you expand that upon a 17-game season, 98 targets, 72 receptions, nearly 600 receiving yards, and 4 receiving touchdowns. That's the kind of production we could potentially see out of JAHMYR GIBBS in the receiving game, because the only other receiving threat within this offense that is going to impose more of a command upon targets is Amon-Ra St. Brown. Outside of that, maybe Sam Laporta is going to step up as the number 3, but JAHMYR GIBBS should be the number 2 receiving option of this offense going into this year. And if he has the ability to not only get 70 plus receptions, or perhaps even get into the range in which Alvin Kamara presented back in his rookie year, 100 targets, 81 receptions, if we're able to reach that overall potential, JAHMYR GIBBS has league-winning upside. You got to remember, since 2013, the last decade of fantasy football, there have only ever been 5 running backs selected within the top 12 of their respective draft. Saquon, Fournette, Zeke, Christian McCaffrey, and Todd Gurley. Those running backs in their rookie seasons were averaging 250 plus fantasy points, similar to the stats that I mentioned in regards to Bijan Robinson. There is so much potential value, and there are statistics that show us that running backs that are selected this year early are given a lot of potential workload. So why go ahead and look at stats if we're not going to utilize them in order to find success in fantasy football? Now, with that all said, when we compare JAHMYR GIBBS to Alvin Kamara, we are doing JAHMYR GIBBS a disservice, because quite frankly, we are overhyping his potential. Alvin Kamara in his rookie season had 120 attempts for 728 rushing yards, a 6.07 yard per carry average, 8 rushing touchdowns, 100 targets, 81 receptions, 826 receiving yards, over 10 yards per reception, 5 receiving touchdowns, and a kickoff return. He quite literally had 14 touchdowns and over 1,500 all-purpose yards and 81 catches. That is going to be a very difficult benchmark or watermark for JAHMYR GIBBS to potentially hit. But luckily, he's behind one of the best offensive lines in the National Football League, and they have one of the easiest strength of schedules at the running back position. The rookie running back has a lot of potential in 2023 to be a league winner for sure. Moving on, let's talk about J.K. Dobbins. J.K. Dobbins last season obviously was coming off the ACL injury, had a couple setbacks, and from week 7 through 13 had to miss time to go ahead and clean up the knee. Once he returned from the knee injury, from weeks 14 through the NFL playoffs, was averaging 15 touches per game and 13.00 fantasy points per game and a half PPR, while also averaging 6.56 yards per carry. When I mention that statistic, I need you to understand just how special that is, because when you go back to J.K. Dobbins' rookie season, he averaged 6.0 yards per carry. He was the #1 running back amongst all backs in terms of a yard per carry average with 50 minimum attempts. Additionally, when you look at the last decade of fantasy football, in fact, if you go back to 2010, there have only ever been 6 running backs that have been able to average over 6 yards per carry with a minimum of 100 carries within a season, as of the time in which, of course, J.K. Dobbins accomplished that. The year after, I think Rashad Penny was able to accomplish that. That was a huge year where at the back end of the season came back healthy and was dominating. But ultimately, the efficiency that J.K. Dobbins has presented on the ground is ridiculous. And the fantasy production that he has, of course, shown us since 2020 has been there. Anytime J.K. Dobbins has played 45% of the snaps or more, he's averaging 13.21 fantasy points per game. Now, of course, with all this success, teams want to go ahead and stack the box against the Baltimore Ravens. And they've done that. And they still haven't found success against J.K. Dobbins. Last season, amongst 8+ defenders in the box, J.K. Dobbins was the #1 overall running back, averaging 6.4 yards per attempt against 8+ defenders in the box. Last season, he was facing 8+ defenders 36% of his overall offensive snaps. That in itself, absolutely ridiculous. J.K. Dobbins is highly efficient. He's in an offense that now has a healthy Lamar Jackson, healthier offensive line, and now they bring in Todd Monken. And Todd Monken should be able to bring in a more pass-happy attack. But we got to remember, besides being the offensive coordinator of the Buccaneers in 2018, where they passed the ball a bunch with Jameis Winston, you go back to 2019, he was the offensive coordinator of the Cleveland Browns. In that season, they ran the ball the 11th most times amongst all teams in terms of running back rushing attempts with 358. If, in fact, we see Todd Monken continue to lean upon the running game and J.K. Dobbins, I will not be surprised, especially considering J.K. Dobbins is another year away from that ACL injury. He should be significantly healthier, and he is working to try to potentially secure a contract this upcoming offseason. There is a lot of potential for J.K. Dobbins to be that breakout player that is being undervalued within an elite offense that has league-winning upside. Moving on, let's talk about James Cook. The second-year running back out of Georgia has a lot of potential, especially considering Devin Singletary is no longer in this backfield. Now, when we look at what James Cook was able to accomplish last year, of course, 507 rushing yards on 89 attempts. Again, pretty good overall yard per carry average, 5.7 in fact, which was #3 amongst all running backs in the National Football League last season with 50 attempts minimum. Pretty good overall numbers. Additionally, he was able to secure 21 receptions on 32 targets, 180 receiving yards, and even though he only played 29.5% of the overall offensive snaps, he still was given a pretty good number of overall touches. And it took a little while for James Cook to find his footing, and late in the season, they truly began to trust him more. But now that you no longer have Devin Singletary within this backfield, a running back who has finished as RB24 and RB20 in the last 2 seasons, if all of that overall workload and opportunity is going to go in the direction of James Cook, who, like I mentioned, is highly efficient with his touches. I mean, last season, in games in which he played 40% or more of the offensive snaps, was averaging 12 fantasy points per game. He was only able to accomplish that 4 separate times. So even though they limited him in the games in which they go ahead and give him a pretty decent amount of workload, he's going to be fantasy relevant. Now, when we're talking about an offense that, of course, is hyper efficient with Josh Allen, Stephon Diggs, Gabriel Davis, Dalton Kincaid, an elite defense, this team is going to continue to be at the top of the league. I mean, since 2020, the Buffalo Bills have been the #1 team in terms of total offensive touchdowns per game on average, just slightly ahead of the Kansas City Chiefs. This is an elite offense that's going to continue to give themselves opportunities, not only, of course, through the 20s, but especially in the red zone. Josh Allen in the last 3 seasons has scored 19 rushing touchdowns in the red zone. If, in fact, Damian Harris is going to play a role within the red zone, it is what it is. But if we get into a scenario in which James Cook is additionally getting himself touches in the red zone, and they're going to limit the amount of rushing attempts that Josh Allen is going to have, many of the ideas around this offseason and the reason why they brought in Damian Harris and Latavius Murray to this offense revolves around the idea that they want Josh Allen to run the ball less in order to keep him healthy. If that's going to be the case, besides, more rushing attempts going towards a guy like Damian Harris, which is not going to touch the bottom line of James Cook. It also will potentially maybe even lead to more checkdowns and more receiving work for someone like James Cook, because there's no way Latavius Murray or Damian Harris are going to be involved at all within the receiving game, which only continues to increase the potential upside of James Cook. A highly efficient back that last season, amongst all running backs in the National Football League, in terms of rushes of 15 or more yards, he was able to accomplish that on 12.4% of his overall rushing attempts, number one amongst all backs, and was ahead of guys like Tony Pollard, DeAndre Swift, Nick Chubb, J.K. Dobbins, and Ramondre Stevenson. Other names that I've either already mentioned or I'm about to in just a couple moments. Overall, I truly do believe James Cook, his efficiency, and the fact that they're going to only expand upon that, leads to him potentially being a league-winning upside running back in 2023. Moving on. Now, I just mentioned DeAndre Swift a couple moments ago. DeAndre Swift joins the Eagles organization, was traded this offseason because, of course, the Detroit Lions, they spent a first-round 12th overall pick on JAHMYR GIBBS. So DeAndre Swift joins the Philadelphia Eagles in a backfield that no longer has Miles Sanders. Miles Sanders last season, 259 rushing attempts, 1,269 rushing yards, 11 rushing touchdowns, was the number 13 overall back in terms of overall fantasy points and 16 overall back in terms of fantasy point per game on average. Last season, he played 50+% of the offensive snaps in 15 of his overall 17 games, and of course had 10+ touches in 16 of those overall 17 games. Miles Sanders was a great back for this team, but no longer have him. This is an organization that, of course, wants to run the ball behind one of the best offensive lines in the National Football League. In fact, last season, they were in the middle of the pack in terms of running back rushing attempts with 368, 16th amongst all teams. But, of course, we have to take into account that Jalen Hurts is obviously going to continue to be a rushing factor within this offense, and especially down in the red zone. But with that being the case, amongst all of the running backs on this roster, DeAndre Swift, Kenneth Gainwell, of course, Rashad Penny, and Boston Scott, the most talented running back is DeAndre Swift. Whether it's on the ground or through the air, he is going to be the most efficient. I mean, you look back at his 2022 efficiencies. In terms of fantasy points per attempt, 0.88, tied with Austin Eckler last season. In terms of games in which last season he was given 10 or more rushing attempts, was averaging 23.27 fantasy points per game. He averaged a 5.47 yard per carry average, 3.1 yards after contact per attempt, and was only given 23 overall red zone attempts for 5 red zone touchdowns last season. If you compare that to what the running backs of the Philadelphia Eagles were able to accumulate in terms of 71 red zone rushing attempts that led to 17 rushing touchdowns, the opportunities within this offense are going to be plentiful. It's just a matter of, can DeAndre Swift stay healthy? He's a running back that has never played a full healthy season. Neither has Rashad Penny, but there could be opportunities here in which DeAndre Swift, as the clear leader of this backfield, can have himself extreme upside. He can be the Miles Sanders of this upcoming season, purely. A player that is in this backfield and is being highly underrated going into 2023. A player that last season, from weeks 1 through 2, prior to the injury, was averaging 20.35 fantasy points per game. After the injury, was only averaging 10.94 fantasy points per game. But if he can go ahead and accumulate 10.94 fantasy points per game this upcoming season with the Eagles offense, he's still going to be more valuable than where he's being drafted in terms of an average draft position. It's just a matter of, can he stay healthy? Now, when we go back to 2021, we have seen glimpses of DeAndre Swift be a full-time back. I mean, in that year, from weeks 1 through 11 prior to his injury, was averaging 19 touches per game and nearly 16 fantasy points per game. I think the investment is worth the risk. Oftentimes, you'll have the opportunity of drafting DeAndre Swift again, alongside guys like Alvin Kamara. You might want to go with the safer option, like a Kamara, or depending on what you have on roster, go for that league-winning upside with DeAndre Swift. Moving on, let's talk about the final running back. It is Alexander Mattison. We've talked about him ad nauseum this offseason. I truly do believe that Alexander Mattison, based on what exactly this organization, the Minnesota Vikings, their head coach, their offensive coordinator, everything that they have said and they have done, is leaning towards Alexander Mattison being the 3-down back of this organization. And even though being a 3-down back of the Minnesota Vikings may not be as valuable as what it has been in the past, considering the change of the coaching style, Kevin O'Connell, how they want to pass the ball far more, bringing in guys like, of course, TJ Hawkinson and Jordan Addison as of late in order to elevate the passing attack from this offense, I understand that we're going to see less receiving work from Alexander Mattison than we have from Dalvin Cook in seasons past. But let's just take this into account. Last season, the Minnesota Vikings had the 19th most running back rushing attempts, 353. They had the 8th most running back rushing touchdowns. Like we're expecting, if they're going to utilize Alexander Mattison in the Dalvin Cook role, a guy that has been a top 15 running back for the last 4 consecutive seasons, but specifically last year, Dalvin Cook, healthy for the full season, finished as RB10 overall in a half PPR scoring format. There's a lot of upside, especially considering the fact that there's, the running backs Ty Chandler and Myles Gaskin as his backups. I do not believe one of those 2 running backs will be able to overtake Alexander Mattison unless Alexander Mattison is going to find himself injured. So going into this upcoming season, based on the history of success that we have seen from Alexander Mattison throughout his career from 2020 through 2021, in the games in which he was the starting running back of this team in the absence of Dalvin Cook, was averaging 19.5 attempts per game, 18.13 fantasy points per game. Now in the 7 games throughout his career where he's played 48% or more of the offensive snaps, averaging 17.7 fantasy points per game throughout those 7 games, averaging 4.3 yards per carry, 3.03 yards after contact per attempt, has been an efficient running back. I mean, from 2021 through 2022, he's number 4 amongst all running backs in missed tackles forced per attempt. Additionally, throughout that span of time, number 6 amongst all running backs in rushing yards after contact versus total yards. 74.7% of his overall yardage gained on the ground is after contact. He has been a successful running back, and luckily, he's got an offensive line that in terms of continuity has all 5 starters coming back, are the highest ranked run blocking offensive line in terms of PFF grades going into 2023, and they've got the easiest strength of schedule at the running back position. Alexander Mattison, another one of these league-winning backs. Thank you, everybody, for watching. That's going to cover for me today. Tomorrow, we'll talk about bold predictions for the 2023 fantasy football season. If you enjoyed today's content, of course, be sure to subscribe. Click the like button down below. Comment down below what you guys think. Which running backs are you going to be investing in this offseason? Additionally, if you guys have not yet already, be sure to travel down to the description of the video. Check out Underdog Fantasy. Use code Andrew. Of course, make that first-time deposit minimum of $10 and get all the benefits for the entirety of the 2023 season so we can help you capture a fantasy football championship. Until next time, thank you, everybody, for watching, and I'll see you guys. Peace.